Did you know that nearly 1 in 4 Americans lives under a homeowners association? And every year, thousands of families end up in disputes that cost them peace, money, and sometimes even their homes. Have you ever felt bullied by an HOA? Like no matter what you do, they're watching, waiting to pounce on the smallest mistake? I never thought I'd be one of those stories. But in Willow Creek, a picture-perfect suburban neighborhood, I learned the hard way that when you stand up to HOA bullies, you'd better be ready for war. But what I didn't expect was to actually win. Willow Creek looked like the kind of place you'd see on a postcard. Rows of identical 2-story homes with stone facades, trimmed hedges, kids riding bikes in perfect cul-de-sacs. When my wife Emily and I bought our house, we thought we'd found the dream. A safe community for our son Ethan, close enough to my job in the city, and just far enough to feel like an escape. But the dream came with strings. Attached, strings tightly pulled by the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. At first, it seemed harmless. Monthly newsletters reminding us about lawn care, friendly notes about neighborhood events, and some light rules about parking. We thought, fine, we'll play along. But soon the tone shifted. It wasn't neighborly reminders anymore. It was threats, citations, and fines for things so minor they felt absurd. A basketball hoop in the driveway, grass that was half an inch too long. A wooden fence panel that wasn't pre-approved by the architectural committee. It felt less like a community and more like living under a microscope. The man behind most of it was Greg Thompson, the HOA president. Greg was in his mid-50s, gray hair slicked back, always strutting around in his golf shirts like he owned the place. He had this smug smile, the kind that told you he liked being in control. Next to him was Susan Miller, the vice president. If Greg was the king, Susan was his enforcer. She walked the neighborhood with her little clipboard, writing down violations like she was policing a crime scene. And then there was Robert Fields, the treasurer, quiet, but his weapon was money. He made sure every letter ended with a dollar sign, every threat backed by a fine. Together, they ruled Willow Creek like a tiny dictatorship. At first, Emily told me to let it go. "It's just easier to pay the fine, Daniel," she said. But something inside me couldn't. It wasn't just about money, it was about the principle. Every time I paid one of their ridiculous fines, I felt like I was admitting guilt. Like I was agreeing I'd done something wrong when I knew I hadn't, and then came the moment that changed everything. One Saturday morning, Ethan and I were building a small wooden garden fence around the side of our house. He loved planting flowers with Emily, and we thought a little fence would keep the rabbits out. It wasn't anything flashy, just a few panels, barely knee-high. Ethan was so proud, painting it with his little brush, smiling at his work. It was one of those pure family moments. But 2 days later, an envelope showed up. Not a warning, not a fine, this time it was a threat. Unapproved modification. Failure to comply will result in daily penalties. Continued refusal to remove the structure could result in legal action, including foreclosure proceedings. My jaw dropped. Foreclosure. Over a fence? I remember sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the letter, feeling my blood boil. Emily looked at me, worried. "Daniel, what are they doing? This is insane." And Ethan, he overheard. He asked me with those big eyes, "Dad, are they going to take our house?" I promised him no. I promised my son that no one, especially not a bunch of bullies with clipboards, was going to take our home. That was the moment I decided to fight back. I started with the HOA bylaws. Every line, every clause, every confusing paragraph of legal jargon, I read it all. And the deeper I went, the more I realized how twisted their game was. They relied on intimidation, on people not knowing their rights. But buried in those pages were loopholes, contradictions, and protections they didn't expect anyone to actually use. I took notes, highlighted sections, cross-referenced with state property laws. The more I learned, the more confidence I gained. If they wanted a fight, I was going to be ready. But I knew knowledge alone wouldn't be enough. I needed people, my neighbors. So I started talking. At first, quietly, one-on-one conversations in driveways or at the mailbox. I'd ask, "Hey, have you gotten weird fines lately?" And every time the answer was yes. A family down the street was fined for leaving their trash can out for an extra hour. Another couple was cited for having a flower bed. That was too colorful. Someone else had been threatened over Christmas lights. It was endless. And all of them said the same thing. We just paid. We didn't want trouble. That's when I realized we were all living in fear of our own. Neighborhood board. I decided to push further. I invited a few neighbors over for coffee, casually bringing up the idea of standing together. At first, people were nervous. They whispered, looked over their shoulders, worried someone might see. That's how deep the intimidation ran. But slowly they started opening up. One by one, stories poured out. Greg had yelled at a teenager for parking slightly outside the line. Susan had taken pictures of people's backyards without permission. Robert had doubled someone's fine after they dared to question it. It was worse than I imagined. That's when I knew this wasn't just about my fence anymore. This was about all of us. And if nobody else was going to stop them, I would. The first real step was attending the HOA meeting. Normally, they were quiet affairs. 10 people in a room, Greg and Susan doing most of the talking, everyone else nodding along. But this time, I showed up prepared. I had a binder full of notes, copies of bylaws, and a stack of complaints from neighbors who were too afraid to come forward. Emily squeezed my hand as I walked in, whispering, "Be careful." My heart was pounding. But I kept reminding myself, I wasn't just speaking for me. I was speaking for all of us. Greg spotted me right away. He smirked, leaned back in his chair, and said, "Mr. Brooks, nice of you to join us. Do you have another violation to discuss?" The room chuckled. I forced a smile. "Actually, Greg, I do, several, but not mine." That got his attention. I began calmly, reading from their own bylaws. I pointed out contradictions, rules that were vague, rules that were unenforceable, rules they weren't even following themselves. I showed photos of Greg's own house, where his lawn ornaments violated the same rules he fined others for. I brought up financial discrepancies, line items in the HOA budget that didn't add up. Where was the money going? Why were legal fees so high? Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact. Susan tried to cut me off, saying I was out of line. But I didn't stop. My voice grew louder, steadier, fueled by weeks of frustration and the weight of my neighbors' stories. I could see heads nodding in the audience. For the first time, people were listening, not to Greg, not to Susan, but to me. And I realized something powerful in that moment. Bullies only have control as long as people stay silent. But the meeting didn't end in victory. Greg banged his gavel, declared the discussion closed, and dismissed me like I was a nuisance. They tried to shut me down, to silence me. But what they didn't realize was that they had already lost something more important than the argument. They had lost the room. Because when I walked out, neighbors followed me. They patted me on the back, whispered thank you, and asked what we should do next. That was the beginning of something bigger. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing with possibilities, strategies, and risks. I knew the HOA board wasn't going to back down. If anything, they'd come after me harder. And they did. 2 days later, another envelope arrived. This one wasn't about the fence. It was about unauthorized gatherings. Apparently, the coffee meeting I had hosted in my own living room was a violation. They fined me $250. That's when I laughed out loud. They were scared. And when bullies are scared, they make mistakes. The letter about unauthorized gatherings didn't scare me. It lit a fire inside me. If they were that desperate to fine me for having neighbors over in my own home, then I knew I had struck a nerve. Greg, Susan, and Robert weren't just enforcing rules anymore. They were scrambling to keep their grip on power. And that told me one thing. I was getting closer to breaking them. But I couldn't do it alone. That night, I drafted a simple flyer. Bold letters at the top. "Have you been bullied by the Willow Creek HOA?" I listed examples, unfair fines, threats, intimidation, and ended with an invitation. "Join us at my house this Saturday. No fear, no judgment, just neighbors talking." I slipped copies into mailboxes up and down the street. I half expected no one to show up. But when Saturday came, my living room was packed. Families stood shoulder to shoulder, voices buzzing, eyes full of the same frustration I had been carrying for months. One woman spoke up first. She was trembling as she held a stack of letters, fines for everything, from leaving her blinds, open too late to parking her son's bike on the porch. "I paid over $2,000 last year," she whispered. "We can't keep up." Another man raised his hand. "Greg told me if I questioned a fine again, he'd sue me personally." Someone else mentioned Robert adding mystery charges to their HOA bill. As the stories poured out, something shifted in the room. Fear turned into anger. Anger turned into resolve. And resolve, that's when I knew we had a chance. We formed a group right then and there. We called ourselves the Willow Creek Homeowners United. It sounded official, but really, it was just ordinary people deciding they'd had enough. We split tasks. One neighbor agreed to check the county records for any shady HOA filings. Another offered to research state laws. Emily, my wife, began compiling a digital archive of every complaint. I started drafting a petition calling for a full audit of the HOA's finances and a vote to remove the board. It was bold, maybe reckless, but if we didn't push back now, we never would. Of course, Greg found out. I'm convinced Susan was driving around that night, spying through windows. A few days later, I received another letter, this time threatening me with legal consequences for defamation of the board. They were trying to scare me into silence. But what they didn't know was that the more they pushed, the stronger our group became. Every time they sent a letter, 10 more neighbors joined us. By the end of the month, half the community was on our side. The real battle came at the next HOA meeting. This time, the room wasn't half empty. It was overflowing. Chairs lined the walls, people stood in the back, and the tension was thick enough to choke on. Greg looked nervous, though he tried to hide it. Susan clutched her clipboard like a weapon. Robert kept his head down, flipping through spreadsheets. I stood up, binder in hand, heart pounding but voice steady. "Greg," I began, "we're here tonight not just to discuss violations, but to discuss you. This board. The way you've treated the people who live here." Murmurs rippled through the room. Greg laughed, a fake dismissive chuckle. "Mr. Brooks, this is not on the agenda." "Please sit down." But I didn't. "The agenda," I said firmly, "is whatever the homeowners want it to be. And tonight, we want answers." I laid it out piece by piece. Photos of Susan trespassing to take backyard pictures. Records of fines that contradicted the bylaws. Budget reports showing thousands of dollars in legal fees with no explanation. Then came the bombshell, county records showing Greg had hired his brother-in-law's law firm for HOA business, funneling money directly into his family's pockets. Gasps filled the room. Even Robert looked blindsided. Greg slammed his hand on the table. "Enough! You don't know what you're talking about. These are lies!" But the room wasn't with him anymore. Neighbors stood up shouting, demanding answers. One woman cried out, "You fined me for my son's swing set while you pocketed our money." Another man yelled, "You threatened to foreclose on me over a paint color." The dam had broken. Years of bottled-up anger came flooding out. Susan tried to regain control, barking orders, insisting people were out of line. But the more she shouted, the louder the crowd grew. Robert quietly gathered his papers, sweat dripping down his forehead. For the first time, they weren't the ones in control. We were. Finally, I raised my hand and called for silence. "We've had enough. This community deserves better. Tonight, we're voting, right here, right now, on a motion to remove the current board and call for new elections." Greg laughed again, but his voice cracked this time. "You can't do that. That's not how it works." But I held up the bylaws. Actually, it is. Section 8, Article 4, A. Majority vote of homeowners present can trigger removal of board members. His face went pale. He hadn't expected anyone to actually know the rules better than him. Hands went up across the room. One after another, people shouted, "I vote yes!" It was overwhelming. Out of 60 homeowners present, 52 voted for removal. Greg and Susan were done. Robert, perhaps sensing the inevitable, quietly resigned before the vote was even finished. Just like that, the reign of the bullies was over. But the story didn't end there. We still had work to do. In the weeks that followed, we organized real elections. For the first time, people who cared about the community, not power, not control, were put on the board. To my shock, my neighbors nominated me as president. I hesitated at first. I never wanted the title, never wanted the politics. But Emily squeezed my hand and whispered, "You fought for this. Now protect it." So I said yes. We set new rules, not about lawn length or paint shades, but about transparency, fairness, and respect. Fines were reduced, ridiculous regulations tossed out. We opened the books, held open meetings, and actually listened to homeowners. For the first time, Willow Creek felt like a neighborhood again, not a prison. One afternoon, weeks later, I was outside fixing Ethan's basketball hoop when he ran up to me. "Dad," he said, "does this mean we don't have to move?" I smiled, ruffled his hair, and said, "No, buddy. This is our home. No one's taking it away." The look of relief on his face. That's when I knew every late night, every argument, every risk had been worth it. Looking back, I realized the lesson was bigger than just one HOA. Bullies exist. Everywhere, in schools, in workplaces, even in neighborhoods. And they thrive when people stay quiet. But when you stand up, when you refuse to be intimidated, when you rally others who've been too afraid to speak, you discover something powerful. That fear doesn't last, but courage spreads. So to anyone watching this who's ever felt crushed under the weight of an unfair HOA, or any group that abuses its power, I'm telling you now, you're not alone. The fight might be hard, the odds might look impossible, but you can win. I stood up to HOA bullies in Willow Creek, and I won. And you can too.